We now turn to the third part of part 4, namely obedience and disobedience. Now, there are a variety of moral questions here. These include such questions as, do the citizens have an obligation to obey the state? If so, why? If not, why not? Now, if we assume or establish that citizens are obligated to obey the state, there remains the question of, what is the extent of that obligation? And of course, perhaps the most commonly considered question in this area is this: what should a person do when his or her conscience conflicts with the orders of the state or authority? And there's of course also sort of a fundamental question when we're sorting out the matter of obedience, namely, are people obedient by nature or not? And this sort of ties in quite well with the previous question raised in the section on moral education, namely, are people good by nature, bad by nature, neutral by nature, mixed, etc. Because in the case of obedience, if people are naturally obedient, for the most part, this would seem to entail that it would be difficult for them to disobey. And so we may wish to be more forgiving when people obey and do bad things. Because if people are by nature obedient, it would be hard for them to disobey, even when they know that it's wrong. If people are by nature non-obedient, then we of course would probably hold them more accountable for obeying when they could, not necessarily have to do so. Now, in considering the question, are humans obedient by nature, one researcher, fairly famous, Stanley Milgram, decided to look into this. His main question was not so much why are people obedient, but his question was about how seemingly normal people in Germany during the Holocaust could engage in this terrible behavior. He was investigating essentially the nature of evil. Now, in Stanley Milgram's famous experiment, in each sort of instance, there'd be two people. There'd be a learner who was actually an actor, pretending to be the learner. And there's also the person who's supposed to be the teacher. And this is the way it would work. The learner, who's an actor, would have an electrode attached to them. And the teacher would have a control panel. And they were told, which is not true, that it would administer electric shocks ranging in intensity. And the learner was supposed to learn a list of word pairs, and each error would result in a shock being administered. And the person who was playing the role of the teacher was told the experiment was to see the effects of, say, pain on learning. But in reality, of course, the experiment was aimed at determining whether people would obey in the face of doing something clearly wrong to other people. Now again, the person wasn't really being shocked, it was all fake, but the person who was playing the role of the teacher did not know this. In Milgram's experiment, the result, at least according to Milgram, was that the majority, 2/3 of the people, administered the shocks all the way to the highest setting. This is despite the pleading and obvious pain of the learner. They did this when the person running the experiment told them to continue. Now, the person running the experiment had no power to enforce their imperatives. They're just, a person running the experiment. Now, interestingly, or boringly enough, when the people were asked to make a moral judgment on what they should have done, everyone, 100%, saw disobedience as the right thing to do, yet the majority of people did not disobey. Now, Milgram concluded that people were essentially obedient. Of course, an alternative explanation would be that people are basically, bad and are willing to do such bad things. And of course, there are a variety of other ones. But the experiment does shed some interesting light on human behavior. Now, turning to more philosophical concerns, there is the question of the basis of obedience. Now, it's generally accepted, but not by everyone, especially anarchists, that citizens have an obligation to obey the state. And one common way to argue for this is based on benefits. The idea is that the state benefits the citizens, and therefore the people should obey. Another common argument is agreement, that people agree to obey. A contract. You say you do your part, they'll do their part, and you're obligated to hold to a contract. Now, in the past, and perhaps even today, some rulers claim a divine or other special right to be obeyed, other than, say, the agreement of the governed. Now, there's also a pragmatic reason, namely that the obligation is merely practical, in the sense that people should obey or act as if they're obligated to avoid being harmed by the state. Now, as it might be imagined, there's extensive debate over obedience and disobedience, in terms of the basis of this obligation to obey, the extent of the obligation to obey, when people should or could disobey. And of course, there's kind of a spectrum here. On one extreme, we have the idea that citizens owe complete and unquestioning obedience to the state. Another extreme view, held by anarchists, is that the citizens have no obligation at all to obey the state. In fact, the state shouldn't exist at all. And of course, there are more moderate views in the middle, which have varying degrees of obedience between the extreme of totalitarianism, total obedience to the state, and anarchism, which is there is no state. Now, in discussing disobedience, one of the main focuses tends to be on conscience. And the idea is basically, but the way the debate is usually cast, is a conflict between the individual's conscience and the obligation to obey the state. Now, even though the great philosopher Jiminy Cricket said, "Let your conscience be your guide," it's worth considering the possibility that perhaps the conscience is not always a good guide. Now, in some cases, perhaps it is. For example, there may be cases in which the individual's conscience or morality is good, and the orders of the state are wrong. For example, a soldier might be told to massacre, murder unarmed civilians, say in like Syria. Now, if the soldier opposes that, follows his conscience and doesn't murder the citizens, we'd be inclined to say that that was a good action. But of course, we need to take into account that maybe the individual might have a bad conscience, a bad morality, and the orders of the state might actually be right. For example, I recall seeing some years ago on the History Channel a police officer who's quite honestly saying that, back during the Civil Rights Movement, he was racist, and he was ordered to protect the Civil Rights Marchers. And he, said that at the time he totally disagreed with him and thought they were, that they shouldn't be doing that. But he said that he obeyed his orders, that he was a police officer, he was told, by his the rightful authority to do this, and he did so. And so in that case, we'd probably be inclined to say that he was correct in obeying the state and disobeying his conscience. Now, of course, in other cases, you might have a bad conscience in a bad state, or good conscience conflicting with a good state somehow, and various other combinations. Now, one plausible way to resolve these disputes is by assessing the moral status of the individual and that of the state. And of course, that takes us to the general problem in ethics of determining what is good and what is bad. Now, as a final point of consideration, in addition to sort of the general, should one obey or disobey, there are also specific situations or types of situations. For example, in some cases, an individual's profession puts the person under special obligations to obey. For example, soldiers are expected to obey authority, but they're also held to standards of moral responsibility. So the idea is, of course, that, in some militaries, the soldiers are not required to, in fact, are expected to disobey orders that are illegal or immoral. And of course, the challenge is obviously enough sorting those out. Another example, the police are especially expected to obey the authority of the law, to not simply go with their own conscience, good or bad. As a final example, government officials are also expected to dutifully obey the laws of the state. Now, in some cases, we may see, their disobedience as an act of, say, more morally correct behavior. For example, if someone believes that same-sex marriage is morally acceptable, and you have a government official who issues, marriage licenses to same-sex couples in violation of the law of that state, the person might be seen as acting correctly, even though they're breaking the law of the state. Although, of course, from the standpoint of the official should do what they agreed to do, they'd be acting wrongly. Or as another example, you might have a case where someone, say, refuses the commands of the state, to use a concrete example involving marriage. By law, someone who is a government official cannot refuse, justice of the peace, cannot refuse to marry a couple on the basis of, say, there being, of different ethnicity. Although there was a case in recent years where a person did just that. Their claim was that they believed that mixed-race couples, the marriage wouldn't work, and so he refused to marry a mixed-race couple. And now, naturally, even though he was obeying what he thought was right and obeying his conscience, he'd generally be seen by others as acting incorrectly. As a final point of example, in some cases, individuals' choices or agreements would seem to put the person under a special obligation. For example, when I went to school, in order to get my Pell Grant so I could go to school, I had to prove that I was registered for the Selective Service. And that, of course, created an obligation. Basically, what I was doing is creating a special obligation. I'll sign up for the Selective Service, I'll agree to serve if called upon, and in return I'll get money from the state. And that would put me under a special obligation. Now that brings us to the end of the general look at obedience and disobedience. And next, we'll take a look at a particular reading, namely a look at Socrates and obedience, looking at his views as presented in the dialogue, the Crito.